successful reproductive strategy than the competitors, and it will dominate. Well, at a slightly higher dose, psilocybin, like all CNS stimulators, can be interpreted as an aphrodisiac. In other words, prolonged erection, prolonged interest in sex, so forth and so on. At a slightly higher level, it flowers out into a visionary experience. So it's like a stair-step process where the deeper the organism imbibes this one item in the food chain, the more payback there seems to be. First better hunting, then better sex, then great ideas. Who could turn it down? And I've talked, like, you know, when Rian Eisler and I appeared here, Rian is by no stretch of the imagination a psychedelico. I mean, she's a very straight and very wise lady, but not a stoner. But she said, you're right, there is something going on having to do with pastoralism, having to do with this point in time where the previous pack-hunting primates, instead of killing their prey, began to pen them and began to relate to them, to addict to them, is what it was. And I was saying to someone earlier today, here's a test of how conscious of the real world you are. What is the weirdest thing about a cow? And my victim said, the eyes. And I said, no, the weirdest thing about a cow is its tits, obviously. I mean, have you ever seen tits like that anywhere else? These tits are made to fit a human hand. It's obvious. And so this is an example of very old coevolution, coadaptation. The human being, the cow, and then less immediately obvious, but nevertheless powerfully present, is the mushroom. Joan referred to this morning. You see, I think what happened is women outsmarted themselves. The men were off silently hunting and practicing being quiet as they stalked their prey. The women were creating language in order to describe the taxonomy of these various food plants, of which they probably could distinguish 400 or 500 plants, seasons, soil conditions, variants, unusual conditions of all sorts, which parts of the plant were edible, which were poisonous, so forth and so on. And as always happens when you succeed in an enterprise where you seek control, you inevitably simplify. So the women became so conversant with the power of plants that they realized they need no longer gather them. They could grow them. And then they realized they wouldn't, of course, grow all the plants they knew about. They would only grow those plants that grew easily, produced large fruit, and had a big payback. And suddenly, the women undercut their own power base, and it became possible to silently practice very dulling agriculture. And the gods then became not the gods of the orgy and the hunt and the wild plants, but the gods became corn gods and wheat gods. And it became important to be able to get up early in the morning and walk off to your field and weed, and less important to be able to ecstatically prophesy and have visions. Well, that's just one scenario, but it's worth talking about, I think, because how we image our emergence out of animal organization is going to color very deeply how we image our transition into a transcendental realm. That's why I talk about what I call the archaic revival rather than the new age. All this talk about shamanism is a reaching back 15, 25,000 years to those models to steady us. We should go out the way we came in. which means as a partnership society, as a psychedelic society, as a tribal society. And so by thinking about the origins, we actually gain an intimation of the future. Yes?
The persecution of witches was going on anyway, for those very things you're just describing for women.
Oh yeah, I mean, it is all of a piece. The suppression of women, it's a complicated thing. I mean, it has to do with solar calendars, which gained prominence with the invention of agriculture. See, I think the invention of agriculture was where it began to go wrong. Well, some people say it was the domestication of the horse or cities or this and that, but people idealize the Neolithic and think that this was fine. But I think already in place were notions of hanging on to the land, of storing wealth, of cooperating, coerced cooperation in the production of food, a simplified vocabulary about nature. All of these things were put in place by the Neolithic. But, you know, Arthur Young, some of you may know his theories, he has this idea that every state of freedom is accomplished by a descent into a state of bondage. It's so that, for instance, molecular chemistry is the product of the molecular bond. If you have chemical systems with so much energy that there can be no molecular bonding, then all you have is atomic chemistry. You have not the possibility of organic chemistry. So the coming and going of the male ego, the coming and going of the repression of women and the feminine seems to be related to how much exposure there is to these wild plant states. Because that, you see, women come up against it because they bury the dead, they birth the living, they know that all is not as it appears to be. They are informed of the fact that culture is a charade. But men believe all this stuff.
Well, at least those women that were able to, like the witches, were the women who, and a few men who stayed, who had the wisdom, the wisdom to stay in touch with the lore, the herbal lore, the plant lore. So they acted as midwives. They helped women have abortions when they wanted to get rid of their children. They acted as midwives. They did healing when the doctors at the time didn't have the knowledge to do so. So the Inquisition was kind of the result of an unholy marriage between the power trips of the medical profession against natural healers, which still exists, and the power trip of the church against the animistic religion. It's that because the church put its whole weight against this thing of the scapegoating process of using women as the scapegoats for everything that was corrupt within the church itself. It was because women were sinful and they sold themselves in league to the devil. And so from the church's point of view, they didn't really care about the plant lore. It's very interesting that a lot of plant lore really went defunct with the elimination and the execution of the witches, because there was nobody there who was at all interested in preserving it. In fact, the witchcraft trials give clear indication that when the women tried to say, well, when they were asked, well, why did you go and fly off and do this thing that was been reported to you? Or why did you fall down on the ground and you were lifeless for 3 days? And they said, well, it was because we took this little herb. And the inquisitor said, no, it's because you took the devil. And there's one poignant story actually recorded where the Swiss word for the German word for herb is Kraut, and the Swiss version of it is Krütli. So these Swiss witches that were being prosecuted, and the inquisitors said, well, who is your God? What makes you have these visions and these journeys? And they would keep saying Krütli. And so the inquisitors wrote in their books, they call their God Krütli. They call the devil whom they have intercourse with Krütli, because he's the one that takes them off on these journeys. So as a result, the knowledge got lost. So the lore, the herbal lore of the Middle Ages that the witches preserved was completely lost. I mean, the Inquisition took place between the